Hello, everybody. I'm sorry I can't visit your school this Christmas time. Once again, the virus has made that impossible. So I'm doing the next best thing, producing a video for you, which will help you once again think about Christmas and the real meaning and message of Christmas. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see exactly what's going to happen in the story. The greatest story ever. Some people think, of course, it's a fable or even a fairy story, or did some ancient historian make up the story? I don't think so. I think it was about real people and real places. Let's imagine we can go to Nazareth in the day when Jesus was born. There's Joseph on the left-hand side, a carpenter, very primitive tools, as we shall see later. Mary, probably a teenage girl living at home with her parents, with many duties and jobs to do. Here she is collecting water. In actual fact, in Nazareth, there is a well today, and it's called Mary's Well. And probably that spring was there even in her day, and she would have gone to that spring each day to get water to bring to her home. Nazareth today is not that different from any other place. There's a market there where you can buy all sorts of things. It's a very big place now with lots and lots of houses and flats, as you can see. And right in the center, there's a very big church. It's the biggest church in the Middle East. It looks a bit like this. You can see the dome, and right at the top of the dome, there's a big light, almost like a lighthouse, because the dome and the light represents Jesus, the light of the world. It's called the Church of the Annunciation because we think it was at this place Mary received the news that she was going to have a baby. If you go in the church, you'll see the dome, which looks a little bit like that. It's beautifully made, very, very impressive. And you can see the stained glass windows around the dome as well. But then you can go down to the basement and you can look over a gate. You're not allowed to go in, and you can see a scene a little bit like this. Can you see the old stonework and the stones which have been cemented together? Very ancient indeed. And some people think that this is actually Mary's house. And that's why the church is built on top of it, because that's where Mary had this great news that she was going to have a child. Probably the house looked a bit more like this. In Nazareth, there's a village. It's called the Nazareth village, where lots of different models and things that were there in the days of Jesus have been made. So we can understand a little bit more about houses, about how the farmers worked and what the cattle did and all those sort of things. And this possibly would have been what Mary's house would have looked like. This lady's actually called Miriam, and she tells the people who come to see this exactly what she's doing. She's got some sheep's wool and she's threading it or making it into thread. And then she's going to put it on that loom, and then she's going to make some cloth from which she can make clothes or blankets. It's a long and slow process, as you can imagine. And you can see, if you look carefully, she's actually wrapped around the thread that she's making around a stool that she's turned upside down. And that's how they lived in those days. And Mary's house probably looked a bit like this. It was in her house when she was doing jobs when the angel came, which must have frightened Mary because she'd never seen an angel before. But the angel said, "Do not be afraid. You've found favor with God." Mary wondered what that meant. "You're going to have," said the angel, "a special baby. He's going to be called the Son of the Highest, the Son of God." Mary was engaged to Joseph, but she knew she wasn't going to have a baby. "He will be king," said the angel. And Mary thought, how can this happen? How can this be? And the angel said, "God will make it happen." And when Mary heard that, she thought, God has chosen me to be the mother of his child. Everybody who was her age in those days hoped for a baby one day, and all of them hoped that one day they would be God's choice to bring his son into the world. And now Mary was hearing that she had been chosen, and she was the one who would be the mother of Jesus. Well, Joseph, when he heard the news, wasn't happy. He was engaged to Mary, and he knew that he wasn't the father of the child that she was going to give birth to. But he had a dream one night, and the angel told him, take Mary to be your wife. She will give birth to a child called Jesus, who will save his people from their sins, and you're to look after and care for that child. When Joseph woke up and realized what he'd heard, he did the thing that he had to do. He and Mary were soon married, and they were looking forward to the birth of the baby in Nazareth. Joseph's workshop looked a bit like this. I think one day he was working in his workshop. He had very primitive tools, but with a chisel, he could do all sorts of things. He's made a rake, you can see on the right-hand side. He's probably starting work on a plow on the left-hand side. That's how they had to do their jobs in those days. And it was very difficult. But somebody came running into the workshop one day and said, Joseph, there are soldiers here. They say we've all got to come and listen to their message. And Joseph went out, and there were Roman soldiers, and they said, we have a message from the emperor in Rome. Everybody's to return to the house, to the town where they were born, and register so that we know who has to pay taxes. And the Romans said, you have to do that. Otherwise, you'll be punished if you don't go to the town where you were born. So Joseph and Mary knew that they had to move away from Nazareth for the time being and go down to Bethlehem, where Joseph had been born. You see, Nazareth is in the north, where they lived, in the area called Galilee, and Bethlehem is in the south, in the area called Judea. It's probably 70 or 80 miles to go between Nazareth and Jerusalem. I've been on that journey in a coach, probably took 4 to 5 hours, because the roads are not that great, but it's quite a difficult route you have to use. And we had a stop, but it was fairly straightforward to do that in a day. But for Mary and Joseph, of course, there was no transport. Probably Joseph owned a donkey because he needed that for his work. And that's how they were going to go down to Bethlehem. In the Nazareth village, these people were dressed up in old costumes, and this is how it probably would have been. Joseph walking with a big stick, leading the donkey, Mary riding on the donkey, something like this. 70 to 80 miles on rough roads, a hot climate. It would probably have taken them a week. They probably traveled perhaps 10 or 12 miles a day. Then they had a place where they could stay and then move on the next day. But it was an opportunity to think about what was happening. And that's exactly what they did. Mary thinking about the angel coming and the baby she was going to give birth to. Joseph thinking about his responsibility of looking after Mary and the baby. They would have left Nazareth, a very important viewpoint of Nazareth here, possibly gone down a slope towards the valley. You can see Nazareth there, and they would have gone down a slope, something like this. Probably the road would have been rough, but eventually they would get into the plain of Jezreel, and there they would cross that plain using the roads that they could find, and then come to the River Jordan Valley, and they would go down the valley. Today, it's a place where there's a lot of farming. Those are all greenhouses, you can see, because there's water for irrigation from the Jordan Valley. But eventually they came to Jericho. Jericho's an interesting place. There is a cable car where you can go and see the whole of the city, but it is in the middle of a desert. And so they would have come to Jericho by going through a desert, probably got water and supplies and stayed a night in Jericho. And then they would make their way up the hill towards Jerusalem. They probably would have seen Arabs living in the desert, not in places like this, but more like in tents. They've been there for hundreds and hundreds of years. So it wouldn't be at all surprised that Mary and Joseph in their travels didn't see the Bedouin Arabs. They would go through the desert, which must have been quite difficult for them, and eventually up towards Jerusalem. They would have passed sea level. There's a good road there now, of course, but in those days, just a track. And as they continued their journey, eventually in the distance, they saw Bethlehem on the hill there. Today, it's surrounded by fields, and there are quite a lot of sheep there. So we can quite understand that the story that we have about Bethlehem could actually have happened. This is what the shepherds look like, and possibly a shepherd in Bethlehem would have been dressed like that, maybe had pens, maybe let the sheep wander a little bit more. But each time he's looking after the sheep because they're very valuable, and sometimes wolves would come and kill the sheep. Wild dogs, they had to be protected from all sorts of different animals, and that's why the shepherd is on the lookout, keep looking after his sheep. You can go to a place outside of Bethlehem called Shepherd's Field. You can just see the name on the right-hand post there. And if you go in, you can see the fields all around Bethlehem. Bethlehem's on the left-hand side. You can see some modern flats there. But the fields were very bare when we were there. It was the dry season. They hadn't had any rain for a long time. So it was quite difficult for any sheep to find any real pasture there. But there is quite an interesting statue there to the shepherds of Jesus's time, which is actually a fountain when there's plenty of water for them. The shepherds were watching over their flock by night, we're told. Very boring job. Perhaps they sang to make the time go a bit quicker. And here's a man playing a harp, probably what they would have done. We think they may have spent some time in this cave. This is a cave in the shepherd's fields. There's smoke on the roof, so obviously there were fires inside. And we wonder whether it's possible that if the weather was really bad, the sheep would have been pushed into this cave, or if the sheep were sick, or possibly they were having lambs, they may have been looked after here. And the shepherds perhaps used this as their sort of home, because otherwise they had no place at all. Today it's made into a little church, but it's an interesting place to think that possibly the very shepherds who heard the news about the birth of Jesus actually lived in this cave. I spoke to the priest in charge and I asked him if he spoke English, because in that country they speak two languages. Jewish people speak Hebrew and Arabs speak Arabic. I think he spoke Arabic. He said he knew English, 2 words. I said, what are the 2 words? He said, Manchester United. And I said, well, what's the other 2? He said, fish and chips. He thinks that that's really a summary of our country, Manchester United and fish and chips. Well, there is a church there. And if you go inside this church in the Shepherd's Fields, it's really quite spectacular. On the wall, there have been painted some really wonderful murals telling the story. An angel coming to the shepherds and telling them that this day in the town of Bethlehem, a Savior had been born, who is Christ the Lord. And the shepherds had been told this was a sign. You'll find the baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger. So they went to Bethlehem to find the baby, possibly in a cave, possibly a stable, we don't know. And here are the shepherds in the painting with Mary and Joseph and the baby in the manger. They returned. The Bible says they were glorifying and praising God. They were singing. Possibly one was playing a shepherd's whistle and the others singing and dancing as they went along back to their fields, because they had actually been the first people to see Jesus, and they were so thrilled to be able to do that. Now today, there are still shepherds in the same fields looking after sheep with in much the same way as those shepherds did 2,000 years ago. In the center of Bethlehem is a square. It looks a bit like this. And not surprisingly, it's called Manger Square. And inside the Manger Square, there's a big church. There it is there. It's called the Church of the Nativity. That's the oldest church in the Middle East. You've seen the biggest church. This is the oldest church. And if you go in the church, you go to this doorway here by the arrow, and it's a most unusual entrance. You have to bend down because the entrance is only about 1 meter high. And you may wonder why people have to bend down to get into this church. Well, the reason is this: back in the Middle Ages, hundreds of years ago, when Christians were worshiping in this very old church, people on horses who were opposed to Christianity used to ride into the church and disturb the service. So the people who were in charge of the church bricked up part of the door. So there's only a very narrow door that you can go in. And of course, no horse could possibly enter through that gateway into the church. You go into the church and go down some steps and you find a place that looks a bit like a cave. And on the floor, there's this beautiful star. And around the star, in Latin, is written, "Here Jesus was born." It's quite an amazing place, really. I stood there the first time I went there and was quite amazed. Here on this in this place, the only place in the world that was so important, a place where Jesus was actually born. It may not be quite the same place, but most people think it was quite here. And here is where Mary and Joseph sat. Here is where the shepherds came. Here Jesus was born. May have been a scene a little bit like this. It was a miracle. God's Son had come into this world. And that's really why we celebrate Christmas, as we think of Jesus coming and the effect and all that he did when he came to this earth all those years ago. So what's the meaning of Christmas? Well, it'll be presents, it'll be parties, it'll be all sorts of wonderful activities. I'm quite sure everybody will have a great time. But amidst it all, at Christmas, we say thank you because God sent Jesus. And when you've got all these activities and thinking about so many different things that are so exciting, we wouldn't have had Christmas at all if God hadn't sent Jesus. So we should say, thank you, God, for sending Jesus. So I don't have any problems with Christmas. I just think of it as all about real places and real people. Nazareth, where Mary and Joseph were told about the baby. Bethlehem, where Jesus was born. Bethlehem, where the shepherds lived. Real places and real people. I hope you all have a very happy Christmas, and I hope that you'll enjoy Christmas, but do spare a thought as to why we celebrate the coming of Jesus and all that that means to so many people in our world today. Thank you for listening so well, and I hope you do have a really good Christmas, and I hope that I should be able to come and see you in the coming year and tell more of my stories from the Bible. Thank you.